Hi everyone. When I was asked to talk about refugee health, I'm afraid I'm taking a big turn from that into the first world, because one of the biggest problems that we have in refugee health in Australia, and I speak very loosely about everyone in Australia because we are getting together in every state and territory if we work in refugee health and trying to work together to administer medicine to refugee populations. And our biggest problem in this first world of ours is to integrate children from a refugee background into our Australian community, and a lot of that is about schooling and the misconceptions that come with schooling children in Australia who have come from a camp or a refugee background. So I think the refugee experience directly affects schooling ability for children from refugee backgrounds in Australia. And I think our Australian education system has yet to evolve to meet this demand, and we all face this every day. So in the 2015-2016 year, just as a background, about 17,500 refugee visas were issued in Australia, and then there were an extra from 2015, 12,000 additional places, which you'll all know about, for Syrian and Iraqi refugees. An important figure is that there are about 22,000 people who are in limbo in some kind of bridging visa in our country, of which 3,500 of these are children. And they are very traumatized by being in limbo for years and years and years. Most of the children that, most of the refugees that we see or have seen come from the Middle East, Southeast Asia, places like Myanmar, Burma, and Nepal, and East Africa. Just to remind everyone of the geography, because I needed to see a map, Eritrea is a country with the green arrows. We have had in the past a lot of Eritrean, Ethiopian, Sudanese, and Somali refugees. The figures for 2015 and 16 have moved a little bit, so that the 4 top countries are more Iraq, Syria, Burma, and Afghanistan. The Australian refugee program, that's the offshore program where people come through UNHCR, is one of the most generous programs in the world. And whatever figures you look at, it's a very generous program for that group of people. Our treatment of asylum seekers and our use of immigration detention, I think, is nothing less than absolutely brutal. The prevalence of mental health problems is difficult to define. There's very little literature on this. This study from 2007, which predates including PTSD in under 6-year-olds, looked at Mosul in Iraq, and about 3,000 children, about a third of them, or 37%, had mental health disorders, and about 1 in 10 of those had PTSD by diagnosis, but this didn't include people younger. A study at Westmead this year that was published shows that 63% of their population attending their refugee clinic had high scores on the Child Trauma Questionnaire, a 10-point questionnaire to look at the effects of trauma on the children. Gillian Triggs, you would all be familiar with from the Australian Health Rights Commission, interviewed, or her group interviewed 638 children and 491 adults as part of the Forgotten Children report in immigration detention. And besides the somewhat obvious figure that 85% found negative effects of detention, 60% of parents were worried about their children's development, and a third of children always felt sad, which against the rest of the population is a phenomenal figure, and a quarter of children always felt worried. But the most disturbing part of that report for me personally was the exposure to adult mental health in children, and particularly self-harm by adults. Now, I don't want the organisers to panic about the number of words on that slide and the next one and the next one. Regard this as a photograph, not a wordy slide, because that's the PTSD DSM-5 criteria, and I couldn't summarise it any shorter for children over 6 up to adolescence. And you've got things like intrusive thoughts, avoidance of stimuli which cause traumatic feelings, alteration in arousal. But what changed in 2015 was DSM-5 actually included children under 6 years of age. And again, I'm not going through that slide other than to say to you that what it did was take the developmental stage of the child and put it into the context of diagnosing or being able to diagnose PTSD. Now, the other diagnosis that is relevant to schooling in Australia is the ADHD diagnosis, and everyone here knows that it's inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity. It occurs under 12 years of age. It occurs in 2 or more settings and affects function and is not accounted for by some other mental health problem. Now, the problem is those 2 conditions overlap significantly. And so this becomes a problem because I get asked all the time to diagnose and treat ADHD in children from a refugee background. The overlap symptoms which are recognized in DSM-5 are irritability, the excess motor activity, the concentration difficulties and impulsive behavior, and exaggerated startle. And there's some theory, it's not firm science, that it's related to the central noradrenergic system being dysregulated. And also that ADHD might expose children, not necessarily from a refugee background, to trauma exposure, which later leads to PTSD. PTSD also can lead to ADHD symptoms, as we saw before, with poor concentration, inattention. And again, it is thought to be related to the noradrenergic dysregulation. And it might just be that PTSD is a mimic of ADHD. So the problem we have is that we've got all these traumatic overlays happening for children who are in our schooling system, which is not accounted for by the schooling system itself. I was very interested to read some literature in preparing this talk, which I'd not read before, but which I was a little aware of, that perinatal PTSD in the mother, so the mother prior to birth, may have a long-term impact on maternal-infant interactions and attachment. So that's a mother who's been traumatized prior to falling pregnant, falls pregnant, and is affected by PTSD during the pregnancy. There's also been fantastic work in the Netherlands which shows that mothers with PTSD have less emotional availability and less tolerance of parent-child interactions. And the most fascinating point of their work was that there's clearly an intergenerational transmission of trauma. So that does not preclude children who have been born in Australia to refugee families who've been traumatized from being immune to the effects of the PTSD which occurred in their parents. And I've always thought that that precludes them, that they haven't been exposed to traumatic events. But in fact, there's more and more evidence, and I won't say a huge body of work, but there's more and more evidence that there's an intergenerational transfer of that trauma to the child later. And that can then lead to understandable aggressive parenting behavior where the child and parent are not attuned to each other. And I think most of us who work in paediatrics are becoming more and more overwhelmed by the effect of attachment in everything that we do and all the behavioral conditions that we see. There's also evidence from the same group in the Netherlands that parents are less able to draw on secure attachment representations, and this increases their risk of being insensitive parents, which leads on to effects on the child going forward. And I thought it was interesting that refugee youth who are more exposed to community violence, traumatic grief, lead on to somaticization and phobias, but there was less substance abuse and less oppositional defiant behavior occurring. So how do we fit these children into our schooling system, which is very rigid and has very limited ascertainment criteria? And one of the things we are asked about all the time is to please do cognitive testing, or please refer for cognitive testing, or find a medical reason why the child is behaving like they're behaving. Why is a child who can't speak fluent English and sits for 6 hours in a classroom disengaged, or why is that child not learning? And the problem is we have no standardized tests, particularly for those East African countries, no standardized tests for many cultures and languages. But there is an argument, and the International Society for Traumatic Stress Disorders and Studies has argued that if we use a narrative approach, so we use cognitive testing in the context of where the children come from, we might be able to come to an end point. And I have to commend our Catholic education colleagues who are achieving this much more than our regular public education. So we also know that cognitive function is affected by trauma and the need to learn a new language. And a really important factor in children's apparent cognitive function is being semi-proficient in many languages and not proficient in any. There's also the question with testing about whether we can use an interpreter or not. And most tests, like the WISC test, rely on nuances and the way people express themselves. Using an interpreter just cannot work. Whereas bilingual psychologists, and my experience is bilingual psychologists, give us a much closer cognitive assessment using a bilingual psychologist administering the test, but this is very difficult to find in most areas in Australia. The problem is we've got to fit square pegs into round holes. We've got to fit into Education Queensland, and I'm sorry, I'm just talking for our local environment. And really, at the end of the day, we land up having to, I get asked often if I can diagnose autism in the child so they can get ascertained and get help. Because they're a bit removed and they're a bit prone to line things up and to be disengaged from the classroom. And we're asked often about intellectual impairment and work with our psychology colleagues. Fortunately, Catholic education has a sixth category, which is social emotional, and our guidance officer colleagues in Catholic education are working much harder to use a narrative approach where they use cognitive assessment, but they also add in a whole lot of information that they seek out from the community so they understand where the child's come from or the families come from, and they understand how the community is working, which is often not very functional, having been displaced. So do we do intelligent tests or not? There are long arguments on either side, and that's the only reason I showed you that. Don't panic again about the number of words. So school inclusion, there has been a little bit of research in Australia, and the ability to get refugee children into schooling and effective and progressing is dependent often on making the curriculum accessible, having a very safe and supportive community, and there's been some work in Victoria which has shown that this can progress children quicker and improve their outcomes. And addressing their social and emotional needs is very important, particularly from a very disrupted home background. And if we instill a sense of belonging in culturally and linguistically diverse students, then we can make progress. English as a second language is poorly funded in Australia, even back as far as 2008, and there's little formal schooling. Some of our refugees have been born in camps and their parents were born in camps, for example, Rohingya communities. They're poor funding models to try and support these children. And there's a very big difference between an oral communication culture and written learning. We have a whole lot of cultures which are based on oral learning, and we sit them in a classroom in Australia and expect them to suddenly be able to do written language. The other thing that we found, and has been found across the country, is special education is seen by certain cultures as being a punishment rather than a supportive mechanism for improving the child's outcome. So the education in a non-primary language is a further problem that we don't address in our schooling system in Australia. And failure to progress in a primary language can be an indicator of learning difficulties. And here in Brisbane, we have a state school called Mulpera, where it's a very protective refugee environment where the learning is different to our normal curriculum. But when you move those children into the mainstream after a year or so, that's where things really become difficult for them and their behaviours start to become an issue which are difficult to address other than with Ritalin. So what are the solutions that we have to try and address this? Well, at the moment in Brisbane, I'm very proud to be part, but just a part of, I'm not an organiser of, a fantastic group of people, education, guidance officers, cath ed and public education, transcultural psychologists, medical people, developmental both doctors and allied health. And we've all got together because we need to work together to communicate the same message. We need to talk to each other about what we need to achieve. And I shouldn't be sending someone to get a cognitive assessment, and they shouldn't be sending people to me to get a diagnosis of autism. And we need new referral pathways, which we're working on. And ultimately, and this is a bit of advocacy and hope, is that we can get different funding models for this cohort of people who we misdiagnosing often in order to fit them into the round hole. So my references are there, and I'll take questions. I'm just very proud of that Detention Harms Children campaign that went on, started in Melbourne, which took off really well, and I think social media had a very strong effect on that campaign and protest. Thanks.
Thank you, David. So again, if there's any questions, if people would like to come to the microphones at the floor.
Thank you, David. My name's Scott Sypek. I'm a paediatrician in Adelaide. And you just described the most difficult challenges. I do refugee health work constantly. That was my clinic. It's full of referrals. What's wrong with this child? I love the comment, they won't sit still for 6 hours in a classroom, but they've been living in a refugee camp, you know, for the last 3 or 4 years. They're at home, often Syrian children with, 9 or 10 or 12 siblings. Their parents are on texting people who are under siege in Aleppo overnight. Of course, they don't have a normal upbringing like the other children in the class. And I'm constantly, is this autism? Are they intellectually impaired? Their speech doesn't seem quite right. I just wonder if you could, I'd love to chat to you afterwards about the referral pathways, but just the funding model, whether you've had experience in Queensland yet of the NDIS and how that's influenced it, because it seems to me that with NDIS, for some reason it's not supposed to be the intention, but a medical opinion seems to hold this weight, and so we get a lot of people, you know, they need my signature so before we can advance with any sort of therapy that the child needs. And I wonder if you'd had that experience or with some other sort of funding comment about that.
So the group that we've got together is working together towards that, and it includes guidance officers and all sorts of mental health people involved, child and youth mental health. We don't have NDIS here in Brisbane yet. It comes next year in July. So we haven't yet got into the NDIS model, but we're still getting asked to diagnose autism, ADHD, intellectual impairment continuously. And we have been working, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I'll throw it out there, that in my opinion, CathEd is doing a much better job in Queensland of addressing the issue, which is the issue of functionality rather than diagnosis. And they are working around within their guidelines. So I'm not saying they're cheating, they're just working in a narrative approach, and I use that term loosely, to understand the whole child and fit them into that social emotional category which isn't available to the public health. And to me, that's the best model that I've seen, because I find working with the guidance officers from CathEd, they've just got a totally, they're not fixated on the number, you know, the WISC test says 75, so go home, you're not getting any support or funding.
No worries, thank you. I'd like to take the conversation further. It's an interesting issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And Marianne, if you've got any questions.
Many of the Twitterati in the room have just continued on the sentiments of how shameful and heartbreaking the statistics that you've shared with us. And I know as a nurse on the wards, we're dealing with these not only in the classrooms but in the wards with our long-term patients, recognising these children. Yeah.
Dave, I'll use my prerogative to ask a question. We've heard from Nat that advocacy can come in small and large steps. and you've told us the intergenerational effect of trauma. Offshore detention is ongoing, that generation is still to come. What's our role in doing something more than standing in front of hospitals holding signs?
Yes, yeah, I think that I'm not sure what the easy answer is. I think that we have to advocate to change the model, and I suppose, I don't know, there are people in the audience who would be experienced NDIS. I suppose I had always had this delusion that maybe it might be a functional assessment rather than a diagnostic-based assessment to try and help. And with regard to, if we can form the infrastructure that some of the papers talked about, where we address, we make the children a very active part of the community and address their emotional and social background behind it, perhaps we can make some advocacy moves. I'm not sure if we'll move the 70,000 people out of the berm, but we can keep trying.
And I suppose, on a positive note, have you got any examples of communities that have developed that sense of inclusion to make refugee families feel welcome?
Yes, I think we do have, particularly on the south side of Brisbane, there's some specific schools in that area that have a high percentage of refugee children who have done that and have a regular annual refugee day where everyone comes and cooks, like a fete, a multicultural fete, which brings everyone together. So there have been examples of it. They're small.
I've got one more question from Diana Warburton at First Do No Harm. David, how do you address intergenerational trauma with our current immigration policy?
In 10 words or less.
Vote for a new government. And it was, I don't know if everyone saw yesterday's news about asylum seekers in our community. It's just appalling. And I think the best thing that's happened, in my opinion, and I hope it will result, is the same-sex marriage plebiscite, which has seen this rush of an extra 100,000 people who I suppose we hope will vote for same-sex marriage. And in the same way, I suspect it's the same paradigm. Maybe I'm drawing a long bow, which I do quite often, but I think the two are not dissimilar. And if we can vote, use our power of vote, I believe in the power of one, and I believe that we all have a very powerful voice. And although Bryce Courtenay wasn't my favourite author, I think the power of one concept was very powerful, and I think we should all treat ourselves as powerful in that advocacy. Sorry, it's a bit of a motherhood statement. I don't have a nice, neat answer to that that's scientific that I can write down.